The dog growled at the child every night. When the father found out why, he was horrified. The evening unfolded like any other in the Lambert household. Ellen curled up on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea. Frank sat in his favorite chair, flipping through the channels absent-mindedly. The faint hum of the baby monitor on the coffee table provided a quiet reassurance, a steady reminder that all was peaceful in their son Daniel's nursery upstairs. The house felt still, embraced by the soft sounds of life winding down for the night. Rex lay sprawled across the rug, his massive body stretched out with the easy confidence of a dog who knew his place in the family. The German Shepherd had been with them since before Daniel was born, his loyal demeanor and gentle nature making him the perfect companion. Rex adored Daniel, as if the boy had been the very reason for his existence. Every morning he would trot into the nursery, tail wagging, nuzzling the baby's tiny feet before resting his head by the crib. It was a ritual Ellen loved to watch, a silent proof that Rex saw himself as Daniel's protector. But tonight something was different. Suddenly Rex's head snapped up, ears stiff and pointed toward the stairs. The abrupt movement startled Ellen, her hand trembling just enough to spill a little tea. She looked at Frank, who had already paused the television, his eyes locked onto the dog. "What is it, boy?" Frank asked softly, leaning forward. Rex stood up in a slow, deliberate motion, his entire body tense. A low growl rumbled from deep within his chest, filling the quiet house with an unsettling vibration. His fur bristled along his spine as he fixed his gaze on the staircase. Ellen's heart began to race. "Frank?" she whispered, as though speaking too loudly might set something off. "Why is he growling like that?" "I don't know," Frank replied, standing up and moving cautiously toward the dog. "Rex, what's wrong?" The growl deepened, an eerie sound so unfamiliar coming from Rex that it sent a chill down Ellen's spine. The German Shepherd took slow, purposeful steps toward the stairs, his focus unbroken. Ellen grabbed the baby monitor, expecting to hear something. Daniel crying, an unusual noise, anything. But the faint static remained unchanged. Frank followed Rex upstairs, Ellen close behind, moving carefully as if afraid to disturb the silence. Rex's growls didn't stop as they reached the nursery door. He stood rigid, his large frame blocking the entrance, head slightly lowered, his lips curled just enough to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. This was not a warning growl for an intruder. It was something else, something defensive and charged with anxiety. "Rex," Frank said softly, reaching out to touch the dog's collar. "Hey, come on, calm down." Rex didn't flinch. His growl softened but didn't disappear entirely, as though he were reluctant to let his guard down. With a glance at Ellen, Frank gently pushed open the nursery door. The light from the hallway spilled into the darkened room, catching the soft white curtains fluttering slightly from an open crack in the window. The crib stood in its usual place against the wall, and there, lying peacefully on his back, was Daniel, his tiny chest rising and falling in sleep. "See," Frank whispered, exhaling with relief. "Nothing. He's fine." But Rex did not back down. He stepped into the room cautiously, placing himself between the crib and the door, his body a solid, unmoving wall of muscle. The growl returned, low and persistent, as though something invisible still lingered. Ellen remained by the door, clutching the baby monitor to her chest. Her eyes darted to every corner of the nursery, scanning for anything that might explain Rex's behavior. But there was nothing. No creak of footsteps, no strange shapes in the shadows, just Daniel's peaceful face beneath the soft glow of the moonlight. "I don't like this, Frank," she said finally. "What's he growling at?" "I don't know. Maybe he heard something outside. A raccoon or—" Frank trailed off, clearly grasping for an explanation. He reached for Rex's collar again, this time tugging gently. "Come on, big guy. It's okay. There's nothing here." Rex gave a reluctant glance at Frank but didn't budge until Frank pulled a little harder. With a grumble of protest, the dog finally turned, following Frank out of the nursery, though his head whipped around one last time as if checking for unseen dangers. Ellen lingered by the crib, watching Daniel sleep, She brushed a lock of her son's fine hair from his forehead, her stomach twisting. The nursery felt different somehow, heavier, as though the walls held a tension she couldn't name. Her gaze wandered to the open window, though the night outside was quiet. Nothing but the silhouettes of trees waving in the dark. Rex had to be overreacting. He was a dog after all. But that growl, she couldn't get it out of her mind. That night, Ellen lay awake, staring at the ceiling while Frank snored softly beside her. She thought about Rex, his eyes fixed on the crib, his body wound as tight as a coiled spring. This wasn't like him. Rex had always been gentle and sweet. He wasn't prone to barking at shadows or jumping at noises. What had he seen? Or rather, what had he sensed? The next night, it happened again. It was almost the same time, just as they settled into the quiet rhythm of the evening. Rex was calm one moment. His body sprawled across the floor at Ellen's feet, and then he stiffened. His ears shot up. His head swiveled toward the stairs. The low growl came again, vibrating in his chest like a warning bell. Ellen felt her throat tighten as her eyes met Frank's. "You've got to be kidding me," Frank muttered. This time, they both followed Rex upstairs without hesitation. The nursery was as peaceful as ever. Daniel sound asleep, the window closed tightly now. And yet Rex behaved just as he had the night before, stepping inside the room and planting himself in front of the crib, his growls rumbling like a steady drumbeat. For the next several nights, the pattern repeated, no matter what Frank and Ellen tried. Closing the windows, checking every lock, even moving Daniel's crib slightly away from the wall. Rex's behavior never wavered. At the same time each evening, as though drawn by some invisible trigger, Rex would grow tense and growl toward the crib. Eventually, he began pacing the nursery, his nails clicking against the floorboards, his growl turning to low whines of unease. "It's like he's on edge all the time," Ellen said one night, hugging herself as she watched Rex. "He's never acted this way before." Frank knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his back, trying to soothe him. "There's got to be an explanation for this. Dogs don't just..." He paused, looking up at Ellen with a small frown. "Maybe something's wrong with him. Maybe he's sick or in pain." "No," Ellen said quickly, shaking her head. "If something was wrong, he wouldn't be fine during the day. He only does this at night, and it's only in here, by the crib." Frank didn't answer. He looked back at Rex, whose eyes were still locked on Daniel as though the baby were in danger. Rex's chest rose and fell with slow breaths, his muscles wound tight, his tail unmoving. Ellen stepped into the room, resting her hand gently on Rex's back. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice soft. "What are you trying to tell us?" Rex didn't look at her. He didn't move. His growl hummed faintly in the stillness. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Ellen poured coffee into 2 mugs, the steam curling into the air. Frank sat at the table, one hand rubbing his temples as he scrolled through his phone, dark circles beneath his eyes. Neither of them had slept much. Rex had been restless again last night, pacing the nursery and growling under his breath until the early hours of the morning. Ellen had finally brought him downstairs just to give Frank a chance to sleep, but even there, the German Shepherd refused to settle. "I'm calling the vet today," Ellen said quietly, breaking the silence. Frank looked up, his expression weary. "The vet? Elle, come on. You really think he's sick? What else could it be?" Ellen shot back, placing the coffee mug in front of him. "He's never done this before, Frank. It's like something's changed. Maybe he's in pain or, I don't know. Maybe he's losing it." Frank exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "He's fine during the day, happy, healthy. It doesn't make sense. That's exactly why I want to take him in. Something's wrong with him." Frank glanced at Rex, who lay stretched across the floor nearby, his head resting on his paws but his eyes open, watchful. The dog seemed normal now, calm, even peaceful, but Frank couldn't ignore the tension in the house that had been building over the last few days. "Fine," he muttered. "Call the vet. I'm sure they'll tell us he's perfectly healthy, and then maybe we can move on from this." Ellen didn't answer. She could feel the impatience in Frank's voice, the skepticism bubbling beneath the surface. He didn't believe anything was wrong. Not really. But she couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at the back of her mind. Rex's behavior wasn't random. Later that afternoon, Ellen bundled Rex into the car and drove to the veterinary clinic, his leash gripped tightly in her hand. The dog sat stoically in the back seat, his brown eyes staring out the window as though he, too, felt something unspoken lingering in the air. Ellen spoke softly to him during the drive, trying to reassure herself as much as the dog. The clinic was quiet when they arrived. The faint smell of antiseptic in the air and the soft shuffle of animals in the waiting room. The veterinarian, Dr. Hayes, had seen Rex since he was a puppy and greeted him warmly as they entered the exam room. "What seems to be the issue?" Dr. Hayes asked, kneeling to scratch behind Rex's ears. Ellen described everything in detail: the growling, the pacing, the fixation on Daniel's crib, watching as the vet's brow furrowed in concentration. "Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully before beginning a thorough examination. Rex stood still, patient and calm, as his heart was checked, his joints examined, and his blood drawn. It took nearly an hour for Dr. Hayes to finish his work. When he returned with the results, he looked almost apologetic. "Ellen, I'm not finding anything wrong with Rex. His vitals are strong, his blood work is clean, and there's no sign of pain or discomfort anywhere. From what I can see, he's in perfect health." Ellen blinked. "Are you sure? There's nothing you might have missed?" Dr. Hayes shook his head. "Nothing that would explain his behavior. Dogs can act strangely for a number of reasons. Stress, something environmental, even a shift in routine. Have there been any changes in the house lately?" Ellen's mind raced. "No, nothing out of the ordinary. Sometimes they hear or smell things we can't." The vet added with a small shrug. "If he's fixated on the nursery, could be something as simple as a sound in the walls. A mouse even. He's a protective dog, and it's possible he's just being extra cautious with the baby." Ellen nodded slowly, though the explanation felt thin. A mouse? That didn't account for the deep growl, the anxious pacing, the way Rex's body tensed as if bracing for something unseen. She thanked Dr. Hayes and left the clinic, feeling no more at ease than she had before. That evening, Ellen shared the vet's findings with Frank over dinner. "He's perfectly healthy." Dr. Hayes said it could just be something small, like a sound or a smell. "Maybe it's just a phase." Frank sighed, leaning back in his chair. "See? I told you. The dog's fine, Elle. Maybe he's picking up on our stress. He's probably feeding off the energy in the house." Ellen frowned, pushing a piece of food around her plate. "Frank, it doesn't feel like that. I know it sounds crazy, but I think he's trying to tell us something. Dogs know things. They sense things we don't." Frank set his fork down with a clatter, his patience wearing thin. "Or maybe it's nothing. Dogs do weird things sometimes. They growl at shadows, bark at their own reflections. Rex will calm down, and we'll wonder why we spent so much time worrying about it." Ellen didn't argue, though the unease didn't leave her. That night, as they settled into bed, Ellen's maternal instincts nagged at her relentlessly. Every creak of the house made her tense, her ears straining to hear the faint sound of Rex moving. When the growl came, it was sharper than before, like a low rumble of thunder in the distance. Ellen sat up immediately, her heart racing. Frank stirred beside her. "He's at it again," she whispered, already throwing back the covers. Frank groaned. "Elle," but she was already out of the room, her bare feet padding quickly down the hall. The closer she got to the nursery, the louder Rex's growl became. This time, when she pushed the door open, she stopped cold. Rex stood in front of Daniel's crib, his body tense and his ears pinned flat against his head. His growl wasn't just defensive anymore. It was hostile, as though he were facing an invisible enemy. His tail was stiff, every muscle in his body coiled tightly. "Rex," Ellen whispered, stepping carefully into the room. "What's wrong, boy?" The dog didn't acknowledge her. He stood his ground, his gaze locked on the space just beyond the crib. Ellen's throat went dry as she stepped closer, instinctively reaching for her son. Daniel was sound asleep, his small face peaceful and serene, oblivious to the tension swirling in the room. Ellen bent to lift Daniel into her arms, her pulse pounding. "It's okay, baby. Mommy's here." As soon as she moved him, Rex's growl softened, but he didn't relax. Instead, he turned his head toward the door and barked. One sharp, powerful sound that startled Ellen so badly she nearly dropped Daniel. Frank appeared moments later, his face a mixture of frustration and concern. "What the hell is going on now?" Ellen turned to face him, clutching Daniel tightly. "I don't know, Frank. I don't know what's happening, but something isn't right. He's protecting him. I can feel it." Frank rubbed his face, groaning as he glanced at Rex, whose rigid stance remained unchanged. "This has to stop," he muttered. "We can't keep living like this." Ellen didn't respond. She didn't have the words to describe the knot of dread twisting inside her chest. All she knew was that Rex wasn't wrong. He couldn't be. That evening, the house felt heavier than usual, its silence stretching too far, as if it held its breath. Frank sat at the dinner table, picking at the last scraps of his meal while Ellen cradled Daniel in her arms. Rex lay sprawled on the floor nearby, but his posture was anything but relaxed. His head remained lifted, ears turning slightly with each noise, real or imagined. His eyes darting toward the nursery every few moments. The tension radiating from the dog was palpable, making the air feel sharp and brittle. "I'll sleep in the nursery tonight," Frank announced, breaking the silence. Ellen looked up quickly. "What? Why?" Frank rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I know you're worried, and I'm not saying anything's really wrong, but something's making Rex act like this. If I stay in there, I can see what he's reacting to. Maybe he's just hearing something. A tree branch against the window or a vent rattling. Whatever it is, I'll figure it out." Ellen hesitated, shifting Daniel in her arms. "I don't like the idea of you sitting there all night. What if? What if what, Elle?" Frank interrupted gently. "You're starting to let this get in your head. We took Rex to the vet. He's fine. I just want to prove that there's nothing to worry about." Ellen bit her lip, her face pale. She opened her mouth to argue, but then closed it again, clearly torn between unease and relief that Frank was finally taking the situation seriously. At just past midnight, Frank pulled a chair into the nursery and settled into it, facing Daniel's crib. The room was still except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath the chair's legs as he shifted his weight. He had brought a thermos of coffee, his phone, and a blanket to wrap around his shoulders, but as the minutes passed, he used none of them. Rex lay beside him, his large body curled tightly, but he was far from asleep. Every so often, the German Shepherd would lift his head, ears flicking forward as he listened. Frank exhaled slowly and glanced around the room. In the soft glow of the nightlight, everything looked normal, perfect, even. Daniel's crib sat snug against the far wall, the mobile above it gently swaying as if from some unseen motion. The rocking chair, a gift from Ellen's mother, was tucked near the window, and the shelves overflowed with stuffed animals and baby books. It was a warm, comforting space, but tonight it felt off. Frank couldn't put his finger on it. The first sensation came suddenly. A chill brushed against the back of Frank's neck, so faint that he almost dismissed it. He tugged the blanket tighter around himself and scanned the room. The window was closed, its lock firmly in place, yet the air felt colder now, just by a degree, but enough to prickle his skin. Rex's head shot up. The dog let out a low, muffled growl, his eyes fixed on the crib. Frank frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Rex didn't move. His body remained tense, ears flattened slightly. Frank sat still, listening. It was silent, save for the faint whir of the heating vent nearby. Yet the draft persisted. It didn't make sense. Slowly, Frank got to his feet and stepped toward the window,
pressing his hand against the glass. It was cold to the touch, but there were no cracks or gaps that would explain the draft. He checked the locks again. Nothing. He turned back toward the room, confused, and then he felt it. Vibrations underfoot. It was subtle at first, like the hum of a washing machine running in another part of the house, except there was no washing machine. The faint trembling seemed to rise up through the floorboards, so delicate that Frank might have ignored it if he weren't already on edge. He knelt down, placing his palm flat against the floor. The vibration was stronger now, pulsing gently beneath his hand. "What the hell?" he muttered, his breath misting faintly in the cold air. Rex growled again, deeper this time, his hackles raised. The dog pushed himself to his feet and padded to the crib, standing rigidly as though shielding Daniel. Frank's stomach twisted with unease. His rational mind struggled to fit the pieces together. The chill, the vibration, Rex's unrelenting anxiety. None of it made sense, but something was wrong. He could feel it. Frank stood up and began a methodical search of the room. He checked the vents, shining his phone's flashlight inside to ensure nothing had fallen in. He tapped the walls, listening for anything unusual, though he wasn't sure what he expected to hear. He even looked beneath the crib and behind the furniture, but the nursery revealed nothing. Still, the vibrations persisted, a faint, almost inaudible hum beneath the floor. "Frank?" Ellen's voice startled him, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale and shadowed in the dim light. She clutched the baby monitor in one hand, her gaze darting to Rex and back to her husband. "What are you doing?" she asked softly. Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Elle. There's something weird going on in here. I felt a draft, but the window's closed. And the floor. It's vibrating, like something's humming underneath it." Ellen stared at him, her expression darkening. "You feel it too?" Frank blinked. "What do you mean?" "I noticed it earlier this week. The floor felt strange, like something was shifting, but I thought I was imagining it. I didn't want to say anything because you'd think I was losing my mind." Frank looked at her for a long moment before glancing down at Rex, who stood protectively by the crib. He hadn't stopped growling since Ellen arrived, his quiet warning unwavering. "We need to get this checked out," Ellen said firmly. "Call someone, Frank. Contractor and inspector, I don't care. But something's wrong with this house." Frank opened his mouth to protest but stopped short. As much as he wanted to dismiss everything as coincidence or imagination, the evidence was mounting. The dog wasn't crazy. Ellen wasn't crazy. And the chill, the vibrations, they were real. "Okay," he said, finally exhaling. "I'll call someone tomorrow." Ellen nodded, her relief evident, though her arms were still crossed tightly around herself. Frank glanced at Rex one more time before walking past Ellen and out of the nursery, the weight of the unseen pressing heavily on his chest. The next morning, Frank made the call. The inspector, an older man with a weathered face and gruff voice, agreed to come by the following day to take a look. As Frank hung up the phone, he turned to find Rex sitting by the nursery door, as though guarding it with his very life. During the day, Rex's protectiveness became even more pronounced. He wouldn't let Daniel out of his sight, following Ellen whenever she moved the baby to another room. He rarely lay down, instead sitting alert and watchful, his gaze constantly flicking to the corners of the house as though searching for a threat no one else could see. Frank watched it all with a growing unease. "He knows something's off," Ellen whispered to him at one point, rocking Daniel in her arms as Rex stood nearby like a soldier on duty. Frank didn't respond. He didn't want to admit it yet, but Ellen was right. Something was wrong, something deeper than they could see. The home inspector arrived at precisely 9 a.m., his truck rumbling up the driveway with a deliberate slowness that matched the man himself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a lined face and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that only came from decades of crawling into the dark corners of houses most people would rather not think about. His name was Carl Turner, and he greeted Frank with a firm handshake and a glance at his clipboard. "So," Carl said gruffly, shifting his bag of tools onto his shoulder, You're having vibrations and drafts in the nursery. Huh, yeah, Frank replied, rubbing the back of his neck. Something's off in there. It's hard to explain. Feels like a draft, but the window's sealed tight, and the floor vibrates sometimes, faintly, like something's loose. Carl grunted, his expression unreadable. All right, let's take a look. Start in the nursery. Frank led Carl inside, with Ellen hovering just behind them, Daniel in her arms. Rex trotted alongside the group, sticking close to Ellen's side and glancing warily at Carl. The inspector raised an eyebrow at the German Shepherd, his voice turning softer. That your watchdog? He's a big fella. He's the reason we're doing this, Frank muttered. Rex has been acting up, growling at night, pacing the nursery. It's like he knows something we don't. Carl nodded thoughtfully, though he didn't comment. He stepped into the nursery, pausing in the doorway to let his eyes sweep the room. Frank and Ellen stood back as Carl knelt down, pulling various tools from his bag with the precision of a surgeon. Mind if I move some things? Carl asked, already placing his thermal camera on the floor. Do whatever you need to, Frank said. Carl started with the walls, running the thermal camera slowly along the plaster. His movements were deliberate and methodical, his brow furrowing as colored patterns bloomed on the small screen. Reds, blues, and greens danced across the display, mapping the temperatures in the walls. Frank and Ellen exchanged anxious glances, the faint hum of the device filling the quiet. Carl muttered under his breath, tilting his head as he moved to the far wall near the crib. What is it? Ellen blurted out, unable to contain herself. Carl didn't answer right away. Instead, he tapped a finger against the screen, squinting at something Frank couldn't see. Finally, he turned to them. There's moisture buildup in the walls. A lot of it. This pattern here. He pointed at a dark blue streak running vertically across the display. Tells me there's significant water damage. Frank frowned. Water damage? How? Could be an old leak, maybe the roof, maybe a pipe. Hard to say yet, but it's been sitting in there for a while. And that's just the beginning. Carl stood up, brushing his knees, and grabbed another device. Let's check the ceiling. Frank and Ellen followed Carl's every move with bated breath as he climbed onto a small step ladder. He knocked along the ceiling gently, his ear close to the surface. At one point, his face hardened, and he used a handheld moisture detector. When the device let out a high-pitched beep, Carl muttered a low curse under his breath. What? Frank asked, his voice tight. What did you find? Carl stepped off the ladder and sighed, looking Frank and Ellen squarely in the eyes. The ceiling is compromised. Water's been seeping in for months, maybe longer. The wood up there is soaked, softening it. If we don't fix it soon, you're looking at potential collapse. And if it falls... Carl didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Frank swallowed hard, his mind already imagining the nightmare scenario. I thought the vibrations were from a vent or something, Frank said, his voice unsteady. Are you saying it's connected to this? Carl nodded grimly. That's my guess. Water damage weakens the structure of the house. It spreads, and when it does, the weight distribution shifts. I'd bet good money that the vibrations you're feeling are from the floorboards moving against a rotting beam underneath. Frank paled. Underneath the nursery? Carl crouched, pulling out a flashlight and a pry bar. Let's find out. The room fell silent except for the creak of wood and the heavy thump of Carl's tools as he worked to lift a small section of the floorboard near the crib. Frank clenched his fists at his sides, while Ellen clutched Daniel so tightly he let out a sleepy whimper. Even Rex sat perfectly still, his ears pointed forward, eyes locked on Carl as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Finally, Carl pried the board loose, shoving it aside to reveal the space beneath. He shone his flashlight into the exposed gap, his face set in a grim line. There it is, he said after a long pause. The main support beam under this section of the nursery is rotting. Badly. He pointed into the darkness, where splintered wood sagged visibly, its edges blackened with decay. If this had gone unnoticed for much longer, the beam could have snapped completely. That floor would have given way. Ellen staggered back, clutching Daniel closer to her chest as the blood drained from her face. "Oh my God!" Frank's stomach dropped, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Would it have taken the crib down with it? Carl's jaw tightened. If Daniel had been in here when it gave out, it's a damn miracle you caught it when you did. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the faint creak of the compromised wood. Frank couldn't breathe. His gaze turned slowly to Rex, who was still watching Carl, his body poised like a coiled spring. The dog had been right. All this time, Rex had been trying to warn them. His growling, his pacing, the night spent planted between the crib and the door. "Rex knew," Ellen whispered, her voice trembling. "Shifts in the structure, they pick up on all of it. You're lucky to have him." Frank looked at the German Shepherd, his throat tight. Rex, their quiet guardian, had saved their son's life. If they'd ignored him, if Ellen hadn't pushed for answers, Frank crouched down and ran his hand over Rex's head, his voice thick with emotion. "Good boy, Rex. You saved him." Rex tilted his head slightly at Frank's tone, his tail thumping the floor once in response, as though he understood. "What happens now?" Ellen asked Carl, her voice shaking. "I'll write up my findings," Carl replied. "You need to get a contractor in here immediately. The water damage has to be addressed, and the support beam needs to be replaced before it gives out." Ellen nodded numbly, tears glistening in her eyes as she turned to look at Daniel, who was still dozing peacefully in her arms. Frank straightened, his gaze sweeping the room that had nearly been a death trap. He took Ellen's free hand in his, squeezing it tightly. "We'll fix this," Frank said, his voice steady despite the weight of what they had learned. "We're lucky, thanks to Rex." The dog remained by the crib as if standing guard, his body relaxed but his eyes watchful. The pounding of hammers and the whirring of drills echoed through the house as the workers began their repairs. The nursery, once serene and perfect, had been stripped down to its bones. Pieces of rotted wood were piled in black garbage bags near the window, the faint scent of damp decay lingering in the air. Frank stood with his arms crossed, watching the contractors move methodically through the room, ripping away damaged beams and sections of wall. The scene was surreal, unnerving, and he couldn't shake the thought of how close they had come to disaster. Down the hall, Daniel's crib had been moved into the spare bedroom, a small, sunlit space that had previously been Frank's office. Ellen sat in the corner, rocking Daniel gently while Rex lay sprawled on the floor nearby, his head resting on his paws. For the first time in weeks, Rex seemed at peace. His body was relaxed, and his ears flicked lazily every so often as he dozed. The tension that had gripped him for so long was gone, as if he knew the danger had passed. Frank poked his head into the room and smiled faintly at the sight of them. "How's he doing?" he asked, his voice low. Ellen looked up from the baby, her expression soft. "He just went down for a nap." "And Rex?" She glanced at the German Shepherd, who thumped his tail once at the sound of his name. "He's finally calm again." Frank stepped inside, lowering himself into the chair opposite Ellen. He studied the dog for a moment, marveling at how dramatically his behavior had changed since the repairs began. There was no growling, no pacing, no anxious energy. Instead, Rex seemed content to simply be close to Daniel, his body a silent wall of protection. "It's like he knows the problem is being fixed," Frank said quietly, his eyes drifting toward Daniel. "It's crazy. All this time, I thought he was losing it." Ellen's gaze met his, her voice soft but firm. "He saved Daniel's life, Frank. If Rex hadn't been acting the way he was, if we hadn't listened..." She trailed off, holding Daniel just a little tighter against her chest. Frank swallowed, his throat tight. He didn't like to think about the what-ifs. What if they had ignored Rex completely? What if the beam had given out in the middle of the night, sending the crib crashing through the floor? What if they had dismissed the dog's instincts as nothing more than a strange phase? The thoughts haunted him, and the realization left him shaken. "I almost brushed him off," Frank admitted, running a hand over his face. "I thought he was just being weird. I didn't trust him." Ellen reached out, resting her hand on his knee. "But you did listen eventually, and that's what matters. We caught it in time." Frank nodded slowly, glancing at Rex again. The German shepherd stirred, lifting his head to look at Frank with those steady, intelligent eyes. It was as though the dog understood everything, that he had been right all along, and that his humans had finally come to see the truth. "You knew, didn't you, boy?" Frank murmured, his voice thick with gratitude. "You knew something was wrong." Rex's ears twitched, and his tail thumped softly against the carpet. He shifted closer to Daniel's crib, settling himself once again in his familiar position, always near, always watchful. Over the next few days, the workers confirmed what Carl Turner had suspected. The damage was severe. The water had been leaking for months, slowly rotting the support beam and weakening the floor beneath the nursery. It was a disaster waiting to happen, one that would have gone unnoticed until it was far too late. As Frank listened to the contractors explain the extent of the damage, he couldn't help but feel a sick twist in his stomach. "You're lucky you caught this when you did," one of the workers said, shaking his head as he wiped sweat from his brow. "A little longer, and that beam would have snapped like a twig. The whole floor could have given way." Frank nodded silently, his gaze drifting toward the spare bedroom where Daniel was still napping. Rex curled beside him. Lucky. That word didn't sit right. It wasn't luck. It was Rex. If it hadn't been for him, they never would have known. The final repairs were completed at the end of the week. The nursery was restored, better and safer than before, but Ellen hesitated to move Daniel's crib back into the room. For now, she seemed content keeping him in the spare bedroom where Rex had taken up permanent residence. The German shepherd no longer growled or paced at night. Instead, he settled himself beside Daniel's crib, his head resting just beneath the edge as though keeping constant watch. Frank found himself spending more and more time sitting on the floor next to the dog, his back leaned against the wall. The quiet of the house felt different now, safer, but not forgotten. It was impossible to shake the gravity of what had nearly happened. One evening, Frank sat beside Rex, absently scratching behind his ears as the dog closed his eyes in contentment. Ellen stood in the doorway, watching the two of them with a soft smile. "You've been spending a lot of time with him lately," she said. Frank looked up and shrugged. "I owe him." He glanced down at Rex, who opened one eye lazily, his tail giving a small wag. "He saved us. He saved Daniel." Ellen stepped into the room, holding Daniel on her hip. She moved to sit next to Frank. The three of them gathered around Rex, who seemed to accept their attention with quiet dignity. "He's our hero," Ellen whispered, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of Rex's head. The dog lifted his head slightly, giving her hand a gentle nuzzle before resuming his watchful position. Frank rested his arm around Ellen, his gaze lingering on Daniel's peaceful face. "You know," he said quietly, "I always thought he was just a pet, part of the family, sure, but I never thought about how much he really understands, how much he sees." Ellen smiled faintly. "Animals have their own way of knowing. It's like they can sense things we can't." She glanced at Rex, her expression soft. He knew Daniel needed protecting, and he didn't stop until we listened. Frank nodded, the weight of everything settling in his chest. He had always considered himself practical, a man who believed in things he could see, touch, and explain. But Rex had changed that. The dog's instincts, his unshakable loyalty, had been the reason they were sitting here now, their son safe and sound in their arms. Frank reached out to stroke Rex's fur one more time. "Thank you, boy," he said softly. "I'll never doubt you again." Rex didn't move, but his eyes shone in the dim light, and Frank could almost swear there was an understanding in them, a quiet acknowledgement that his job had been done. Ellen held Daniel close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some heroes don't wear capes," she said. "They just wait quietly, watching over us, until we finally see them." Rex lay still, his body a calm, steady presence in the room. Outside, the evening darkened, and the house fell into peace once more. But this time, it was a different peace, one born of trust, resilience, and the quiet, extraordinary bond between a boy and his protector. The house had been fully repaired for over a week, and for the first time in months, it felt like a home again. The nursery, once stripped bare, now stood renewed, its fresh coat of pale blue paint gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. The faint smell of new was still lingering. The crib had been moved back to its usual spot against the far wall, its mobile spinning lazily above it, the small plush animals swaying gently as though nothing had ever happened. Yet everything felt different now. Ellen stood in the doorway, watching Daniel nap peacefully in his crib. She exhaled a quiet sigh, the kind of breath that carried gratitude. Beside the crib, Rex lay sprawled across the floor, his head resting on his paws. The German Shepherd had claimed this spot permanently, as though it was his duty, his life's purpose, to guard the child who had no idea how close danger had come. The rhythmic rise and fall of Daniel's chest was mirrored in the steady breaths of the dog, a quiet synchronization of protector and protected. Ellen crouched down, running her fingers gently through Rex's fur. "You're his guardian angel, you know that?" she whispered softly. Rex's ears twitched slightly, but he didn't stir, content to rest near the one he'd sworn to protect in his own quiet way. In the weeks following the discovery of the rotted beam, Frank had told the story to nearly everyone who would listen. Neighbors, co-workers, even the mailman who stopped to chat one afternoon. At first, his voice had carried traces of disbelief, as though he couldn't quite reconcile what had happened. But over time, the disbelief shifted into something deeper: reverence. It started one evening when their neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Parks, dropped by to bring a fresh batch of cookies. She perched herself on the couch as Frank recounted the events, gesturing animatedly as he spoke. "Rex wouldn't let up," Frank said, shaking his head with a small, amazed smile. "He growled and paced every single night, right by Daniel's crib. We thought something was wrong with him at first, but turns out he was warning us. If we hadn't listened, if we'd ignored him." Mrs. Parks pressed a hand to her chest, her expression softening. "Animals are so intuitive. They know things we don't. They feel it. I'm glad you paid attention." Frank nodded. "Me too. It's changed how I look at him, how I look at all animals, really. They see more than we give them credit for. I'll never doubt that again." Word of Rex's quiet heroism spread quickly after that. The neighbors began stopping Frank in the yard to ask for details, each of them marveling at the dog's instincts. Parents listened more closely to their pets, wondering if their own animals might be trying to tell them something. One man even admitted he'd started letting his Labrador sleep near his son's bed, just in case. At night, when the house finally quieted and Frank lay in bed reflecting on everything that had happened, he felt the weight of it all. He'd almost ignored Rex's warnings. He'd almost let his skepticism cloud the truth, and he couldn't shake the thought of how differently things might have ended. It was a humbling realization, and it deepened his appreciation for the dog that had, without hesitation, stepped into the role of their family's silent hero. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and check out our next Down Tales on screen now.